ranking all 33 handguns and spotlights from worst to best. Between the three main weapon types, gunners undoubtedly have it the easiest. It shouldn't be a surprise that attacking enemies from a distance while never being in danger from most attacks in the game is the safest and most reliable way to play. And on top of that, gunners also have the most options between the three classes, with a whopping 33 handguns to choose from. Some guns are as straightforward as a ranged weapon can be, while others will completely alter how an encounter plays out, in and outside of combat. These are ranked based on a couple hours of experience. I think I've played the game once or twice before. And at the end of the day, like half of the weapons in this game are more than good enough to be viable. One more thing before I start. I do at some point plan on making an in-depth video on normal damage and why it sucks. But until then, I'll just give you the gist. Normal damage is designed to be mediocre. No matter what level you bring it to, no matter what you're against, it will deal an okay amount of damage. Never dealing with enemy weaknesses or resistances, which in a few specific scenarios could be useful, but in a game where you're able to choose between various different weapons with different damage types, and you're able to switch your gear right before most levels in the game, that versatility becomes less and less useful. Number 33, Neutralizer. Not very surprising to see this one first, but there are layers to how impressively bad this weapon is. For starters, this weapon deals normal damage, which, as explained just a moment ago, is bad. Very bad. The best you'll ever get from it is decent, but it gets worse. Catalyzers as a weapon type are fundamentally flawed. By design, this weapon just doesn't work. Why would I shoot enemy 4 to 5 times and then have to detonate those bullets for them to actually deal damage if I could just kill an enemy with 4 to 5 hits from a better weapon? I get that catalyzers have an AoE application, but still, this weapon is just inefficient at dealing damage. It still gets worse. Neutralizer's damage is bugged. Apparently, for no reason at all, neutralizer bullets, when detonated, deal less damage than Biohazard. I'm not entirely sure what the damage numbers are supposed to be, but clearly something is wrong here. Despite this, Neutralizer's damage is working as intended, according to the GMs. I'm not sure what kind of backwards testing they did to come to this conclusion, but to be honest, even if they did find out what was wrong, I'd be more surprised if they actually went ahead and fixed it. A real shame, because this and the next gun are two of the most fun weapons in the game to use. Number 32, Grand Tortle Fist. Man, I really wish these weapons were good. They have such a unique design and could have given gunners a decent close range option. Most players probably looked at the weird attack chain and went, ew, what is this? Why do I lunge forward? Why does it have no range? And they'd be right, but there is kind of a learning curve on how to use tortle guns effectively. The light attack, although difficult to do consistently, can stun lock smaller targets. The awkward lunge takes a bit of getting used to, and the excessive knockback can actually be used in tandem with the lingering crystals from the charge attack. Which, on the other hand, has a whole plethora of issues that I'm not even going to get into in this video. But I will mention the very surprising amount of damage the crystals can deal when a target is pushed into them. Also, you're going to see a trend where the normal damage variant of a weapon is usually the worst, and you'll see me rank it before the other ones. Number 31, 30, and 29, the other three Tortle Fists. I was originally going to rank these separately and write different paragraphs about the pros and cons of each one, but it wasn't until after I made this list that I realized that all 4 Tortle guns are right next to each other. Tortle guns are very underrated. I didn't say they were good, but they're significantly better than most players give them credit for. One thing that I've noticed that with weapons like tortle guns and shard bombs, most of the players that craft them will use them at level 1, see how bad the damage is, and then let them collect dust in their inventory, only ever re-equipping them as a meme or to show off. Give these guns a chance. At level 10, the damage that these weapons deal is actually quite impressive considering the reputation these guns have. Also, straight up stun locking dreadnoughts and Trojans will never not be funny. Number 28, Sentenza. The Sentenza is a rapid-fire shadow damage gun with good speed and good range. I've officially run out of positive things to say about this weapon. Antiguas are notorious for having some of the most scuffed hitboxes of any guns, with the exception of maybe Magnus's. This gun will struggle to hit a ghost block at point blank while simultaneously hitting a target through another block. The charge attack locks you in place, it only covers a narrow line in front of you, until the last shot, which actually deals decent damage. The mere existence of weapon switching shoves Antiquas out of viability, as the benefits of having a 6-shot attack chain is completely lost when you're able to continuously fire the same 2 shots from a better weapon. Number 27, Argent Peacemaker. Most of what I had to say about Sentenza applies to Argent Peacemaker as well, but I decided to rank this one slightly higher because I feel like elemental damage has a little bit more application. And also, that charge attack can pack quite the punch. It's situational and very risky to use, but when it works, it's actually pretty good. Probably the closest thing we'll get to an elemental Magnus. Number 26, Biohazard. Biohazard, unlike its normal damage counterpart, actually has the potential to be a decent weapon. The damage isn't completely terrible, and the poison status goes a long way with making me think that the weapon is good. Catalyzers do have some team synergy, as other players are able to detonate your catalyzer shots and vice versa. The problem being, if your party doesn't bring a catalyzer, then you automatically become a deadweight to your party, unless your party members subconsciously agree to let you attack that one enemy in the corner and go out of their way not to attack it. Catalyzers also have a hidden benefit. If you're poisoned, you can focus on only placing charges onto enemies, and if you detonate them after the poison wears off, your charges will deal regular damage. This also works vice versa. If you place a bunch of charges and then activate a damage buff, all of your charges will deal increased damage. Number 25, Supernova. Okay, I have something to confess. I really don't like pulsars. I know that they give gunners a somewhat reliable AoE option, and if you're narrowing your playstyle down to just guns, then yeah, these are probably your go-to options for dealing with groups. But come on, we have an entire weapon category that specializes in crowd control. Heck, we have swords that can outperform these in groups. Supernova technically deals the most damage of all the pulsars, as it doesn't inflict any sass effects. It's just that it deals normal damage, which automatically brings it down to unbearable tier. There's almost no reason to use this since we already have elemental and shadow damage pulsars, and the monster families that are weak to piercing just so happen to be really good at evading slow projectiles. Number 24, Obsidian Carbine. Number 23, Volcanic Pepper. Okay, fine. I don't know why I had such a hard time writing something about Obsidian Carbine. It's the only Antigua that has a sass effect instead of a damage bonus, which automatically makes it the most relevant. It's one of 3 handguns that can inflict poison, which makes it a decent sidearm, but unless you're using the charge attack, the damage will never exceed expectations. On top of all the downsides that Antiguas have, there are like 3 better kiting options for shadow guns anyways. Number 23, Volcanic Pepper Box. A personal favorite of mine, autoguns function very differently from most guns. By design, they're a high-risk, high-reward weapon type, restricting movement for good burst damage. In reality, when taking weapon switching, shield cancelling, and having absurd amounts of ASI into account, autoguns are busted. None of that movement restriction matters when your positioning and attack speeds are good enough. That charge attack alone is one of the strongest attacks in the game. Unfortunately, Volcanic Pepper Box has just about everything working against it. It deals normal damage, it fires the inferior projectile compared to the other autoguns, and I'll explain why that matters later, and it also inflicts fire, which isn't inherently bad, but it is reducing what is already mediocre damage. Congratulations, Volcanic Pepper Box, on being the worst autogun. Number 22, Valiance. Blasters are probably the most basic weapon type in the entire game, and that's good. It has a 3-hit attack chain, fires a simple projectile that deals good damage, and has just the right amount of knockback for it to be useful, but not too much for it to be a nuisance. And consistent knockback at that. The only downside I can possibly think of is the underwhelming charge attack, which isn't even that bad of an attack. It's actually pretty good at staggering enemies. Valiance is the single most versatile weapon in the entire game. You can never go wrong bringing this to any level in the game. Unfortunately, due to just how the nature of normal damage works, Valiance will never excel in any one particular thing. It's good literally everywhere, but never great. I'll let the fact that this is the second to last normal damage weapon on the list speak for itself. And don't worry, we won't be seeing the other one until much, much later. Number 21, Polaris. I'm really just not a fan of the knockback. I understand that a skilled player can use pulsars effectively, but the thing is, if your movement and spacing is good enough, you won't need to rely on a push everything away playstyle. Polaris comes with a benefit. The shock status can create these bursts of damage, where an enemy stops being knocked back and will be hit with 2 to 3 shots all at once. Personally, I'm not a fan of the shock status, mainly because of how inconsistent it is. Most of the time, you either anticipate a shock proc on an enemy and end up missing half of your shots if it doesn't happen, or you anticipate a shock proc not happening and end up missing half of your shots when it does happen. I know that shock can be helpful, it just isn't most of the time. Number 20, Permafroster. I haven't even mentioned how notorious these things are to being a detriment to your party. The way that the vast majority of players use pulsars becomes a nuisance to just about every other playstyle in the game. Permafroster is the only shadow damage pulsar, and it packs quite the punch. The free status has a similar dynamic as Polaris, with stopping knockback. Definitely one of your best picks if you're going against groups of gremlins, as each shot knocks them onto their back. Number 19, Wildfire. It mostly boils down to the fact that there are just better weapons for everything that pulsars can do. Single target DPS, crowd control, knockback. There are weapons that do a better job in any category without being as unreliable as pulsars. And I want to reiterate, if you decide that you're only going to use guns, and you're going to ignore any and all other tools that the game gives you, and restrict your playstyle down to just guns, then yes, pulsars are good. Wildfire is the only pulsar I would actually recommend. It doesn't have any weird status effect knockback gimmicks, which automatically makes it the most reliable, and it also has the most damaging status effect. Number 18, Gilded Griffin. Now, some of you are probably raising an eyebrow about how an Antigua made it anywhere near this spot on the list, but this weapon is far more capable than you think. On top of the fact that piercing damage is lacking in a few departments, this piercing projectile, as per the model's name, is really good at hitting high mobile targets. And coincidentally, the two monster families that are weak to piercing damage become very mobile in later tiers. I would especially recommend this against Devilites, as you can just keep hitting them after they sidestep. Number 17, the Owlite Wand. I was considering not even ranking this one. It's an alchemy that doesn't need to be reloaded, but with a slower fire rate. Other than that, it functions almost identically to an alchemy. If you know how to weapon switch, there's no real reason to use this over an alchemy other than, hey, look how goofy this looks to swing around. Number 16, and number 15, Storm Driver and Hail Driver. Alchemers have a much higher skill ceiling than most guns, not only requiring more effort to weapon switch, but also needing precise aiming in order to maximize your damage. These things perform excellently in groups, and when 2 or more enemies are right next to each other. I don't have a very strong opinion between Hail or Storm Driver. Both weapons function pretty similarly, and both have the same benefits and drawbacks. Personally, I don't see a reason to use either of these over the other 2 elemental alchemers. Number 14, Callahan. This is a tricky one. Callahan functions identically to Iron Slug, but instead deals piercing damage. The problem is that the charge attack is just slow enough to where Devilites and Wolvers will frequently dodge it. Against higher mobile targets like most monsters in the Fiend family, it can be difficult to line up a charge attack, and on the rare occasion that you actually do, it's usually completely overkill. Even in a 4-player Rabid Snarby run, Callahan just deletes Wolvers and Alpha Wolvers. Callahan does have another use though. The light attack is really good at stun-locking enemies. This is true for all Magnuses, but it's especially useful on Callahan if you're against the Devilites. You can just prevent them from doing anything. Number 13, Plague Needle. This one was kinda tough. Rank it too low and you wonder why a weapon that is almost as strong as Blitz Needle is in the bottom half of the list. Rank it too high and you start questioning why an objectively worse Blitz Needle is surpassing some of the best weapons in the game. Unfortunately, unlike the argument between Acheron and Obsidian Edge, the poison from Plague Needle doesn't make up for the damage loss for having a status effect. You could argue for having one person in a 4-player party bring a Plague Needle, but at the end of the day, there are like 5 better sources of inflicting poison. I kept acquisition out of how these weapons are ranked, but it's hard to ignore just how out of the way you have to go in order to craft this when Blitz Needle is available from the Hall of Heroes. And I'm pretty sure the game hands you a Strike Needle recipe at some point anyways. Number 12, Magma Driver. The poor man's Orbitgun, as some would call it. Actually, no one calls it that. I don't know why I said that. I used to think I understood weapon stats, and now Magma Driver has me questioning every weapon description in the game. Misleading doesn't even begin to describe that fire description. For those who don't know, like I didn't for years, Magma Driver, to my knowledge, inflicts the strongest moderate fire in the game. The damage dealt from Magma Driver's fire compares to Combustor's strong fire, which is kind of ridiculous in my opinion. Not the damage, but the fact that it's still labeled as moderate fire. Fire becomes more and more useful the farther you head into the game. It can rack up triple-digit damage in Shadow Lairs and even in Tier 3 against certain monsters. It's crazy to me how underutilized fire is as a stats effect just because it isn't helpful against Vanaduke. Whoa, an editor's note. So the Magma Driver section is partially untrue. The damage dealt from fire is all over the place. It scales off depth, and it's different between different monsters within the same monster family. I did a little bit of testing, and I made this really poorly made chart. The main thing that threw me off was that despite Orbitgun saying that it inflicts moderate fire, it actually inflicts minor fire. The charge attack inflicts moderate fire. Even then, Magma Driver is still pretty good for inflicting fire, and the entire last section about fire being good in the late game is still true. If you don't believe me, bring Ash of Agni to Dreams and Nightmares, or Ice Queen, or any late game mission that isn't Vanaduke. Number 11, Nova Driver. What's this? An elemental alchemer with no stats effects to reduce its base damage? For me? Oh, Snarbolax, you shouldn't have. If it's weak to elemental damage, Nova Driver just shreds it. The only other alchemy you should even consider is Magma Driver, and even then, Magma Driver is being hard carried by its unusually potent fire. If Magma Driver's fire did as much damage as, say, Ash of Agni, then there would be no reason to use it over Ash of Agni. I'm fully expecting replies from players who swear by Hail and Storm Driver's ability to stagger enemies and whatnot, but listen, all I'm gonna say is that in all of my time using either of those two, I've never looked at a shocked enemy and thought, wow, the utility is better than if it was already dead. Number 10, Umbra Driver. I'd like to have whatever the people who said that this gun loses to disc guns were smoking. I've used both weapons in and outside of parties in various parts of the game. Umbra Driver shreds slimes, especially in Tier 4, there's just no competition between the two. Number 9, Phantamos. Personally, I rarely use this one. If I want a high damaging shadow gun, I'll use one of the two that haven't been mentioned yet. And if I want a kiting gun, I'll most likely use an Antigua or Umbra Driver. But still, Phantamos is a shadow damage blaster, which automatically makes it one of your best picks for shadow damage. Number 8, Rift Locker. As mentioned earlier, the lack of a piercing variant on some of the kiting weapons automatically gives the two that we do have an upper hand. Another reason as to why blasters dominate the competition against kiting guns is just how good they are outside of combat. Having a fast and reliable ranged weapon to be able to just run through levels is really all you need for like half of the game. Emphasis on reliable. Personally, I prefer the speed and range of Antiguas if I'm just running through levels, but man, those hitboxes. It's hard to justify just how awful those hitboxes can be sometimes. Number 7. Arcana. The best blaster to bring to a level ultimately depends on what's in it, and from my experience, elemental damage seems to be the most useful overall. I'm not sure if it has anything to do with the abundance of late game undead and construct missions, or the ratio of elemental weapons to the other damage types, but Arcana is the blaster that people tend to use the most. Number 6, Grim Repeater. Shadow damage, autogun. Enough said. Have fun deleting giant lichen colonies from existence. Oh, and Jelly King 2, I guess. Number 5, Iron Slug. Have you ever wondered what it would be like if you took a cannon from a pirate ship and proceeded to use that to pummel the denizens of the Clockworks? That isn't even an inaccurate description of Iron Slug, since we literally have a reskin of that in the game. This weapon class is just busted. With a well-positioned charge attack, you can one-shot enemies at literally any stage in the game. Like, the amount of damage this thing is capable of is just absurd. What's crazy to me is the fact that this is a normal damage weapon. Every other normal damage weapon we've seen is painfully mediocre, and here's Iron Slug absolutely crushing the competition. That alone should go to show how overpowered this weapon class is. Number 4, Winter's Grave. Now, there's a dynamic between Winter's Grave and Iron Slug that most people can't seem to wrap their heads around. Yes, Iron Slug is more consistent, and with a well-positioned charge attack can outdamage Winter's Grave even against slimes and gremlins, but few players actually take advantage of how the free status changes the way that this Magnus is used. With Iron Slug and Callahan, your best bet for maximizing damage from the charge attack is to make sure the enemy you're hitting is facing you, so that they get knocked back into the bullet as it travels. But Winter's Grave is a bit different. With Winter's Grave, you don't have to worry about positioning or which enemies are aggroed onto which party member, or what direction enemies are facing. You're able to just fire, and if that freeze procs, which admittedly is a little inconsistent at times, you're able to quite frankly just one-shot most enemies in the game. Not to mention that the freeze status also allows you to just bully certain enemies by making them unable to move. I mean, just look at this. Iron Slug can't do this. Number 3, Overcharged Mixmaster. I want to settle a debate between Mixmaster and Orbitgun. Well, actually start one, because nobody ever talks about the differences between these two guns. Between hours of YouTube videos, live streams, and seeing it in-game, I can confidently say that the shock status from Mixmaster is not nearly as helpful as people think it is. I'd say a good 80% of shock procs that happen don't matter. You either shocked an enemy that was too far away to pose a threat, or you shocked an enemy that was about to die anyways. The damage dealt from shock is abysmal, so the argument that, well, it's extra damage isn't valid to begin with. And out of the remaining shock procs that actually affect the gameplay in some meaningful way, I'd say about half of them actually become a hindrance, either by stopping an enemy from being moved away or by delaying an attack that you were expecting to happen. I kid you not, I can't even tell you how many times I've seen a player with a Mixmaster trying to kill a Dreadnought, and it stops moving halfway through its attack, and the player isn't able to get behind the Dreadnought and hit it in time, all because of the inconsistency of the shock status. I kept acquisition out of how weapons are ranked, but it baffles me how a weapon with a worse, less damaging, less helpful stats effect is more than double the price of Orbitgun. Players are paying twice as much for a stats effect that is not only less helpful in fewer situations, but tends to be a hindrance to the player more often than not. I genuinely can't wrap my head around this. I understand that the absurd price gap is mostly due to rarity. Mixmaster currently is only obtainable from flash sales via the auction house, but still, this makes less sense to me than the UV ticket market. Number 2, Celestial Orbitgun. I don't even need to explain how broken these guns are. Everybody knows about the outright oppressive single-target DPS, the fact that Mechanites and those Almirian goblins hanging out in Shadowplay and Legion of Almire won't try to block the bullets, and the charge attack that's able to hit through walls. This gun is actually broken, and I mean that it isn't balanced. Every attack fires 2 bullets that each deal the same damage as an Alchemer, and enemies literally can't register Orbitgun pellets as a projectile. Contrary to popular belief, disc guns aren't just fire in the vague direction of something and just win without even looking at the screen. Well, they are sometimes, but it isn't without its drawbacks. The bullets travel very slowly and it has much shorter range than most guns. And because of the way Orbitgun pellets move, they're extremely inaccurate. Disc guns are one of the worst weapons in the game when it comes to destroying crystals and other terrain. There is kind of a learning curve on how to use these things optimally. It mostly comes down to movement and manipulating how the bullets arc back towards you. Something that I noticed when gathering Mixmaster footage that I thought was kind of funny is that a lot of players like to jitter from side to side when using Orbitgun or Mixmaster. And to be fair, if you're using any other kiting gun, that is an optimal way to move around to avoid attacks. But when you're using a disc gun, constantly moving around like that will actually cause you to miss more often than if you were standing still. The best way to move around while kiting with a mixer is to have short pauses to let the bullets travel, or to move forwards and away from your target. This allows most of the bullets to land and maximizes DPS. Number 1, Blitz Needle. Most veteran players will probably say that the disc guns are the most broken weapons in the game, but only the mentally insane players realize that Blitz Needle deserves that title far more. For starters, Blitz isn't too different from its autogun brethren. It's got pretty nutty single target DPS, and a charge attack that is way stronger than it probably should be. But Blitz Needle has a tiny quirk that completely breaks the weapon class. It deals no knockback. It shouldn't be hard to understand why keeping an enemy close to you while you hit it with a charge attack is better than pushing it away where fewer bullets will land. But it gets even crazier than that. Blitz Needle also happens to share that same piercing projectile as mentioned earlier, which allows you to do some pretty weird things, like hitting a Trojan when you're on the side of it, not even facing its back, or hitting Grillin motors through their shields. Alright, I just need to take a second to emphasize just how stupid this part is. It doesn't even matter what direction the Grillin motor fire is facing. As long as you just do a blitz charge point blank, you just kill him. He's just dead. It doesn't even matter what direction he's facing. It doesn't matter if you hit his shield. It just kills him. It hits him and it staggers him, and it makes no sense. Both of these things, combined with the fact that Blitz doesn't have any unnecessary status effects or damage bonuses tied to it, allows you to do things like this, the Blitz trick. I mean, just look at this. You think Mixmaster is broken? This is broken. If some of you want me dead after some of these rankings, then please, let me know in the comments. I am just thrilled to read them.